pastor. He had never been, this guy, he is working full-time he's the song leader in an independent Baptist church, and he's working as the headmaster of a Christian school in an independent Baptist church. And he had never been baptized by immersion. He was baptized by his Methodist dad by sprinkling. He didn't even, and so that got me to look at it. But he had been hired. Why? Because he went to Bob Jones University, and it was it was a fundamentalist school. I think a lot of independent Baptists, since then I've just meditated on, I think a lot of independent Baptists, really all they are is they're just old-fashioned Methodists. And what it is you make a profession of faith, and then after you make a profession of faith and join our church, I will spend the rest of my life making you conform to what I think a Christian looks like. And I do think a lot of churches that's what it is. It's just making, if I can get you to behave a certain way, then everything's going to be good. And the truth of the matter is, I totally reject that principle. I mean, I do want us all to behave as becoming Christ. I do. I think what we believe, when our heart is right and our faith is right, it's going to show up on how we act, and how we behave. But I am not interested in trying to make you behave a certain way. My desire is to see our hearts drawn to the Lord. That's really what I'm after. And so, man's heart has to change before his actions. I'm going to move. Since we don't have it up there, I don't know how to fill in the blanks, and so I don't have one of the sheets here. So I'm not going to help you fill in the blanks. Now I'm going to start skipping some things, and so you're going to have to just live with it. All right. So and here's the thing: every one of us will, and I've already used a lot of time, so going to have to skip some to get through this. Every one of us is individually accountable to God. That's in our passage, Romans 14 and verse 12. It says, "So then every one of us shall give an account of himself to God." So because of that, I don't have any I don't have a right to try to make you conform to what I think is God's will for you, and I don't have any right to do that, and really I don't have any reason to be upset if you don't conform to behavior that I think you ought to conform to, because I'm not the one who's going to give an account to you. Now, the Bible does say that as a pastor that I do watch for your souls. I'm going to give an account of how I've done that. I'm not going to give an account of how you've lived. I'm going to give an account of how I've shepherded you. That's what I'm going to give an account of. So we can try to persuade a person's heart and mind about what's true, what's biblical, those things, but we don't have the right to force a person or coerce them into, by any means, into agreeing with us. Number two, then, historically, this idea of individual soul liberty, it is a Baptist distinctive. We're living in today, again, they call it religious tolerance, and it seems like almost everybody's jumped somehow onto the bandwagon of of soul conscious or liberty of conscience. If this in fact was true, that there was a bishop or a cardinal or whatever he was called who said this thing that, granting a religious exemption by virtue of liberty of conscience, if he did that, that's all modern. That is all a modern thing for denominations to do that, and I think it has to do with it's because they recognize the popularity of a Baptist conviction. The idea of individual soul liberty. And by the way, though I have never been to those countries to these countries to know that it's true, I do understand that in countries that are predominantly Catholic, that there is no liberty of conscience in those predominantly Catholic countries. Missionaries who work in places where there's the Catholic priest controls the city. You have to get the Catholic, where a Baptist missionary has to get the permission of the Catholic priest to be able to preach in that city. Or the missionary goes to that city and it's the Catholic priest who turns the people against him, the work of the missionary. There is no such thing as liberty of conscience in those places. For sure, it happens here because, almost everybody in America likes the idea of freedom of conscience. being able to do what we want to do, whether it's a religious issue or an American issue. We all just like the idea of being able to do what we. Don't you think that? No, isn't it one of those things? You believe you have a right to go to Oregon when you want to go to Oregon. If you lived in Europe, you don't just cross state lines from Germany to Austria. There's a checkpoint. And, you say, well, that's different countries. Well, they do call those states. And they're not any bigger than our states. It's just that in the United States of America, we chose to make it where this entire thing is open. And, and it's a religious conviction that I get to go to Oregon when I want to go to Oregon. Anyway, so I'm just, but honestly, this idea of individual soul liberty, it is historically a Baptist conviction. It's one of those reasons. It's not the reason why Baptists were persecuted. Baptists were persecuted because they believed that, and because they owned a Bible and they read the Bible for themselves. They were persecuted because they wouldn't baptize their infants into the Catholic Church, and they insisted that a person should be baptized under the authority, by immersion, after salvation, and under the authority of a scriptural church. And they didn't believe the Catholic Church was a scriptural church, and so they had no authority to baptize. They were persecuted because they wouldn't go to a Catholic church, and everyone was required in particular areas to go to the Catholic Church, and they wouldn't be there during the Mass, and they were persecuted for those things. They were persecuted because they held services, illegal services. They would meet out in a barn or in the woods and stuff, and they would hold worship services that were not sanctioned by the state and the government and so forth, and those were the reasons they were persecuted. But the reason they did all of those things that they were persecuted for was because they believed in individual soul liberty, that a man would be held accountable to God on his own. And therefore, everyone was responsible, number one, to come to God on his own. Number two, to know God's word on his own. Number three, to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience and not those of the state. History does not record even one incident where a Baptist group persecuted a non-Baptist group. So their history is filled with accounts where the Catholics or the Lutherans or the Presbyterians persecuted people who were Baptists, or even just someone not be, Catholics persecuted Protestants and Baptists, and the Protestants persecuted other Protestants and Catholics and Baptists. And during the days in England, there was a period of time where every time they got a new monarch, a new royal, they would go through a series of persecutions. So they'd have a monarch who was Catholic, and the Catholic would kick out all of the Church of England guys and execute and kill people, and then and pretty soon there would be an uprising, and they would execute the Catholic or the Catholic monarch, and then they would get a Protestant monarch who would execute all of the let me see, I'm going to get them back. Where all of the Catholics that were the Catholic Archbishop and all of the Catholic priests and anyone in the country that was a Catholic, and then pretty soon that monarch could get whacked, and now another Catholic would be in there, and he would do the same thing. And that was England was like that, where they just go back and forth, killing each other all the time, and all the time the Catholics were killing the Protestants, and the Protestants were killing the Baptists, or killing the Catholics. The Catholics and the Protestants were killing the Baptists. They all just did that. But historically, you can't find any account where a Baptist group ever persecuted a non-Baptist group for their convictions. And someone will say, well, that's because the Catholic Baptists have never been in authority, never had enough power to be able to persecute anyone who didn't agree with them. And I'm swiping through a whole lot of material right now to get to here. But so someone will say, well, that's because Baptists have never had the authority, never had the ability. If Baptists did have the authority, wouldn't they do the same thing? Well, they actually were given the opportunity to have that authority here in the United States of America. When our Constitution, when the Bill of Rights was being written up, Madison actually proposed making the Baptist church the state church. It was, and I think what they were talking about, like doing a split established church, and so maybe it was the Congregational Church and the Baptists, and it might have been a split thing, but they were going to give Baptists. They actually proposed making Baptists, giving them government authority to compel people to believe their doctrines. And it wasn't the other group. Maybe if it was the church of the Congregational Church, it wasn't the other group, but it was the Baptists who came and said, no, you misunderstand. We don't want any established church. What we believe is that we believe in freedom of ideas. We want the liberty to preach our ideas and to bring people to persuade people of our ideas. And we want the Lutherans to have the same opportunity, and the Presbyterians to have the same opportunity, and the Church of England to have the same opportunity, and the Congregationalists to have the same opportunity, freedom of ideas. Jefferson and some others thought, well, wow, that is pretty wild, that you could actually win people. People would go to church because they believe something rather than being forced to do it, or that a person would actually support a church, tithe to a church based on faith rather than being taxed, which is, established churches. That was part of what would happen if you were the state church, the established church. Then the government would tax you, and that tax would go to pay for the buildings and the preachers and so forth. And all of a sudden, here we are saying, no. Here's the thing: is if people come to a real faith, they will come to church without being forced, and they will support it without being forced. And that's where we want to be, and that's how we want to be. I'm skipping so very many things. Let me just say the last thing, though, because I'm going to be out of time real quick. So the third point in my outline then was a precaution concerning individual soul liberty. So here's the thing. As a Baptist, I am glad to support everyone's right to worship as they please, or even to not worship at all if that's what they please. I support that. I wished everyone would come to church, and I wished everyone would come to a Baptist church. In fact, I wished everyone came here. But I'm not going to be mad at people who choose otherwise. I'm not going to spend my life losing sleep over people who choose otherwise. And I might preach against it. I might preach in favor of why, what we're doing is the right thing. I'm going to do those sorts of things, but I'm not going to go out and someone's house and say, now here's the thing: you haven't been at Bible Baptist Church in the last month, and if you don't come back next month, we're going to come to your house and we're going to burn it down or something like that. We're not going to be that way. We are glad to support everyone's right to worship as they please or not to worship at all, but a couple of provisions for that. This doesn't mean that we don't care. The fact that I don't make someone believe or practice like I want them to believe and practice doesn't mean I don't care for them. Baptists have always been missionary-minded. Always. One of the two men who were considered, I think, the leaders in modern Baptist movement and in modern missions, not just Baptist missions, but modern missions. The two leaders of that would be William Carey from England and Adoniram Judson from the United States of America. And both of them were Baptists. William Carey was a Baptist shoemaker in England, but he's a believer, and he made his living making shoes, and got so burdened for people in, maybe it's not Burma, I can't remember where he was at right now, but he became so burdened for them that he went to Baptist churches and started and raised money, and it was a hard thing for him to do, because Baptist churches, that one place, one preacher said, "Young man, sit down. If God wants to win the heathen in X country, he can do it without your help or mine." And so he had to work at getting churches that would actually support him to go to the field and to be a missionary there. But it was and modern missions is built based on what William Carey did, and the idea of getting support from churches back home so that you can go to a foreign field and you've got the means now to live on that foreign field, to be a presence and a witness there. Then in the United States of America, one of and at one time, missionary work was outlawed in the colonies. But the first missionary sent out from America was Adoniram Judson, who went to Burma. Actually, and to be full disclaimer, Judson did not leave as a Baptist. When he got on the boat to go to Burma, he was a Congregationalist. But on the boat, as he's crossing the ocean, he's reading his Bible, studying, and by the time the boat landed on the other side of the Atlantic, he had become convicted of Baptist doctrines and found a Baptist in whatever country it landed. So the boat landed somewhere in Europe and then made its trip down to Africa. And wherever it landed, he got out, sought a Baptist to baptize him, scripturally baptize him before he got to the mission field. But very first missionary out of the United States of America was a Baptist missionary, Adoniram Judson. So we do care. Baptists do care for the souls of others, and we're going to reach out to. So the fact that I'm not going to make somebody believe, that I don't believe I have the right to make someone believe what I believe, in no way implies that I'm not going to care, that I'm not going to reach out. We are to be soul winners, witnesses, evangelists, missionaries. You and I ought to care. Care enough to go out of our way to talk to others. Care enough to go out of our way to talk to them, even if they get angry at us. They get angry at us, and take a swing. We don't swing back. We just back off. And, but we do care enough to be a witness. And also, we don't want to use the right. We don't have the right to use our personal soul liberties to put a stumbling block before another one. So, Paul he said he was perfectly free to eat any kind of meat he wanted to eat. Individuals. He knew that the idols were nothing, and he was therefore free to eat any meat he wanted to eat. But he also said he wouldn't eat the meat if it offended a brother. And so here's the thing: is you do have a right, you and I, we have individual soul liberty. We have a right to a freedom of conscience. But I also have the right to submit my liberty for the benefit of another person. To insist on my right to the detriment of another is not Christian. To insist, I have this right, and I am going to practice my right, and I do not care who agrees or disagrees. That is not a Christian attitude. The Apostle Paul repeatedly taught that idea. I know what I can do, but I'm going to set aside what I can do because I don't want to be a stumbling block to somebody else. And then the last one here, I'll be done with this. Individual soul liberty doesn't justify disobedience from the Bible. So here's one of the things that a lot of times people will say, well, you Baptists, you believe once saved, always saved. And that means, so you're telling people that once they get saved, they can do anything they want to do. They don't have to obey the Bible anymore because once they're saved, they can't lose their salvation. And so they don't have to obey and individual soul liberty. Well, I have a right to do what I want to do in my life. And I'm just going to tell you something as a believer. Individual soul liberty does not give you permission to disobey the Bible. No one's going to make you obey the Bible. But I'm just going to say, I have a problem with someone who says, I'm a Christian, and God has saved my soul, and I know I'm going to go to heaven. My sins are all forgiven. And since my sins are all forgiven, I'm going to go ahead and enjoy my sins while I can. I have a real problem with how Christian, how saved a person is who's got that kind of an attitude. What would ever possess a Christian who's been forgiven of sin to continue in sin? So individual soul liberty doesn't justify living in disobedience. So we've got about 13 or 14 minutes before the morning service. Let's go ahead and finish up right there.